2.1B. It's a letter, and that is all.
Okay. Good. Okay, motion to approve agenda. Seconded, all in favor? Yes. Okay. Jada.
Jada, that's right.
Get out of here.
Good afternoon.
And welcome.
Thank you.
You are our agenda today.
Wonderful. Happy to be here. So,
Great.
I guess you're ready for me then?
Please.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, Your Worship and Council. My name is Jada Bassi, and I'm the Manager of Housing and Community Planning with City Spaces Consulting, based out of Vancouver. And although I'm based out of Vancouver, I'm originally from the interior, from a small town. So small rural communities has really been an area of practice of mine, what I studied when I went to planning school, and what I enjoyed the most in terms of my practice. So I'm a community planner by training, and I specialize in the areas of affordable housing and social policy planning. And as a consultant, I've worked with numerous communities, numerous local governments across the province on undertaking housing needs assessments and preparing housing action plans, largely policy-based, but also on the regulatory and programs as well. So I'm delighted to speak here today to Council on some of the tools that I have found from my experience works well in small and rural communities. And this is a key area of interest of mine, given that we hear a lot about innovative and progressive housing tools, but they largely come from those urban cities and metro large cities, and as we know, they don't always translate to the more local island context or the rural community context. I also want to mention that I haven't undertaken a housing needs assessment for Bowen Island or studied the key issues and opportunities available here. So what I'm going to present to you today are not recommendations per se, but they're really a holistic overview of some tools that can give some food for thought and some consideration that you might be thinking of in future processes. Now, for municipalities to formulate their policies and establish recommendations, their actions really must be informed by a demonstrated need. So before going to tools, what I like to start off and talk about is the importance of undertaking a housing needs assessment. And this is really an exercise that identifies populations most challenged to afford housing in a local market context. It identifies what the key housing gaps are and any other housing issues. And I understand that Bowen Island Municipality has undertaken a housing needs assessment about 10 years ago. So housing needs assessment forms that baseline of evidence that can form a number of municipal policies, regulations, and strategies. And this can include preparing an affordable housing strategy or a housing action plan, which is pretty much a strategy, but called a different thing. It can inform other policies in the municipality, including those that are found in your official community plan. Housing needs assessment can also support your local nonprofit organizations. And when you establish a baseline, that information can be shared with other groups, and they can understand who's challenged to afford housing in the local market, and they can start preparing their own projects in their capacity, such as developing non-market development projects. So it's available to many other groups. Or a housing needs assessment can do some combination of the above, and of course it is also used to help foster strategic initiatives and partnerships, in particular helping with those conversations with senior levels of government. So when you've undertaken such an exercise, you can start to identify gaps along the entire housing continuum. And that goes from the non-market side on the left side of the continuum to rental housing all the way up to affordable home ownership. So the nice thing about municipality is that you don't necessarily need to focus on one part of the continuum. You can look more broadly and look at the big picture of what the housing issues and gaps are, and then start selecting tools on how to intervene and address those gaps along that continuum, and the tools that are available within the municipal purview. So what I stress about the housing needs assessment is how important this exercise is, because it is this very assessment where you identify the housing needs and gaps, and this directly influences the tools that are appropriate for the response, including your municipal policy. So it is the evidence-based demonstrated need to inform policy development. So the tools that I'm going to be sharing with you today, to know if this tool is the right one for Bowen Island or not, it really needs to be part of a broader exercise that matches that tool with the particular gaps and issues that are happening in Bowen Island. Okay, so now for some particular tools for small and rural communities. So So the first tool I want to share with you is secondary suites. I'm aware that Bowen Island currently permits secondary suites, so this content really reinforces the good work that Bowen Island Municipality is already doing, and perhaps sheds some light on some areas that you may not already be aware of why the secondary suites is even more important in the small rural community context. Secondary suites usually doesn't sound very innovative to most people, but in communities where there is a housing issue and they don't permit secondary suites, this is generally the first area that you'd want to tackle and to address. So secondary suites are those rental units within a single detached dwelling, often as basement suites. They are suitable to many different population types, depending on the unit size and location of the unit, but can be a good rental option for singles to couples, small families, also students and independent seniors. So municipality can encourage and support secondary suites through policy, and for most communities, that is through your official community plan. Municipality can also require that all new single detached units have suite-ready homes, and that means that those single detached dwellings can be adapted in the future to accommodate a suite by making sure you have appropriate room height and windows and plumbing, etc. The one great thing about secondary suites is their ability to introduce rental units within the already existing urban fabric of a community. So adding a basement suite doesn't create a visual impact from the street, and this can be very important for municipalities, especially smaller communities where there's a high emphasis on trying to retain community character while also trying to introduce rental units within the community. And secondary suites are also a very resilient housing form for small rural communities. Across the province, we have communities that are susceptible to changing markets, so especially those resource-based economies or communities experiencing population decline, but also tourism-based markets where the economy fluctuates and then the demand also fluctuates. And so those communities could really benefit from more housing resiliency. So private homeowners can introduce the rental units through the basement suites, for example, and in times of economic challenges and demand for rental drops and vacancy rate is high, those unoccupied basement suites can come on and offline, and that's really the function of a secondary rental market. They can come on and offline, and it also avoids periods of high vacancy rates. So purpose-built rental, those apartments out there, if you have a changing economy, those can be experience high vacancy rates and maybe even have some deterioration of those rental assets. Secondary suites, a bit more resilient for those changing contexts. In terms of scalability, I've ranked secondary suites as having a high level of impact in small rural communities, and it's more achievable ease of implementation because it is a straightforward policy at the end of the day. So municipalities can introduce the policy and encourage suites, but they can't build the units. At the end of the day, still rely on other sectors, and in this case, your private homeowners to actually build the units and implement the policy. Now, secondary suites have different levels in my view. So secondary suites 2.0 include coach houses and laneway homes, which are effectively detached secondary suites. Yeah, and what I've learned is that Bowen Island is also exploring in this area to include more of these types of units. So these are really good alternative secondary suites as they are ground-oriented rental, which are really great options for families with access to outdoor play space, really great for mobile seniors. Sometimes they can be located above a garage as well, but in terms of the overall form, they typically have more light, they're more livable and more attractive to many different populations. So compared to suites within detached homes, coach houses and laneways have more of a visual impact. They can actually be quite attractive, and I would argue improve the overall character of a neighborhood. But if they're done poorly, they can maybe detract, and some residents might find that it might be visually impactful. And one downside is that they're typically more expensive to build to private homeowners compared to secondary suites. It's not always the case, but on the whole, they tend to be a bit more expensive on the capital cost. So in terms of their level of impact, I've ranked them as being quite high because like 1.0, the basement suites, they provide a resilient rental option for small communities. I dial it down a little bit on a bit more challenging on the implementation because of that potential visual impact and the higher cost, capital costs associated with it. So secondary suites 3.0, this is where you encourage secondary suites in duplexes, townhouses, and condos. And in condos, we also are known as lock-off suites. These are great mortgage helpers for homeowners, and they're considered to be quite innovative. But the downside here is that they only really work well in communities where the density can be supported by the market. So thinking about small communities in places like Bowen Island and scale, these type of secondary suites may not be achievable if you don't have the demand or the land values to make the performance work. So in comparison, secondary suites 3.0 have a lower level of impact in small rural communities because you're not really achieving that much more than you would, say, with the basement suites or your coach housing laneways. And they are more complicated and challenging to implement, and you may or may not have the market to really support this type of housing form. The next policy option is supporting and encouraging ground-oriented multi-unit housing. Again, this policy we often see as land use designations within citywide policies such as your official community plan. Now, ground-oriented multi-unit housing can manifest in many different tenures, from ownership to rental to low-end of market rental, affordable, or some combination of these even in one project. So municipalities can designate lands for multi-unit housing. And this is important for private developers, for builders, and for the nonprofit housing sector, because if they are looking to build a project on sites that are already designated for the density to create, say, a mixed income multi-unit project, that really lends well for them to make a rationale and a business case to move a project forward. It provides them with some certainty, and it really lowers the risk of a project, including the approvals process. Often working with nonprofit organizations, if there's a site that comes up and it doesn't have the right density, there is a lot of risk and concern and maybe hesitation on going forward with that project if it requires a significant rezoning, for example. And ground-oriented multi-unit housing is also a very appropriate scale for small rural communities compared to, say, projects that are greater than 5 stories. The level of impact, I'd say, is quite high with this policy. It's a bit more challenging to implement, but not impossible. On the municipal side, it's quite easy to write the policy, but does end up requiring more regulations, so such as zoning, development permit area design guidelines, building inspection, and ensuring that a municipality has the adequate capacity of infrastructure to support it can provide some hurdles along the way in order to implement. So it's a bit more complex compared to, say, secondary suites to provide something like a rental housing form. So the next policy option is creating a family-friendly housing policy. We're really starting to see a lot of traction in West Coast municipalities who are looking to provide more family-friendly housing. And by that, the definition is typically of delivering projects that have 3-bedroom or more units in new multi-unit residential projects. One example in New Westminster, a larger city, they're requiring right now 25% of all new units in their multi-unit projects to be 2- and 3-bedroom units. And of that 25%, at least 5% have to be 3 or more units. So what the family-friendly housing policy is really looking to address is recognizing that there are many families who are no longer able to afford that traditional single detached dwelling, but the apartments and condos in the communities don't have enough bedrooms to accommodate all members of their family. So this is really trying to address that gap. It's trying to incentivize and require in those new projects to have larger units in the traditional 1- to 2-bedroom condo. And this policy works best in communities that have a market that can support the density. In small communities, there's a very delicate balancing act for requiring a specific unit type because it may not always be feasible. Even in New Westminster, they undertook an economic analysis to see what percentage of units would be appropriate to their market, and they also engaged with private developers to test these through pilots to see what the market could really support. But it is getting traction. I know the city of North Vancouver introduced this policy about a year ago. The city of Richmond and Maple Ridge are starting to look at it, and they're still playing around with the numbers to see what they can introduce as well. I rate this as having a low to medium level impact in communities. Ease of implementation, writing the policy is somewhat straightforward, and now we're getting more examples out there that you can use a bit of a template. However, in terms of small markets, it depends on the scale. and what kind of development you can leverage in your community. So undertaking an economic analysis can really help determine whether this is a feasible option or not. Pocket neighborhoods is also an example of a ground-oriented housing typology. And this is a concept that's characterized by clustering a number of detached dwelling units together, usually ranging in size from about 800 to 1,500 square feet. It's essentially an evolved version of the old bungalow court kind of model. Now this housing form is great for small families, and it's also really good for multi-generational households who are looking to live together, or at the very least looking to live close to one another, and they still need a lot of space. These are also very attractive to downsizing seniors, so particularly those who are empty nesters and looking to downsize from their larger home to something smaller, but they're not quite comfortable or ready to go to a condo. It's a nice in-between type of scale for these communities. Pocket neighborhoods are typically implemented through zoning. So some communities have a specific zone for pocket neighborhoods. Summerland is a good example where they've created a specific pocket neighborhood zone. They created that a few years ago. Can also be achieved through creating a comprehensive development zone, a CD zone, if you have a site-specific parcel that you have in mind that you think this would be a good fit for. So the pocket neighborhoods are really wonderful housing typologies for underutilized sites and very large infill projects. And it's also really appropriate for the small and island community context because it's a very efficient use of land, and it's a very good scale that can be integrated with adjacent low-density properties. In terms of the impact, it's about a medium level of impact because it addresses the moderate income households along the housing continuum. And at the end of the day, it does provide more housing choices in a community. Ease of implementation is somewhere in the middle. Again, the zoning is relatively straightforward to create, and there are some templates out there because there's other municipalities that have done this. But there may be a bit of a hurdle for site owners or builders who are not familiar with this concept to introduce it in a community. I find that having design guidelines can help with integrating this project with respect to built form, and design guidelines can also help with builders understand how to achieve this concept and also what the expectations are from a municipality's point of view. Increasingly common in municipalities is formulating policies to co-locate affordable housing with social infrastructure facilities, and that can include facilities such as community centers, senior centers, libraries, and even fire halls. This works well when a municipality has an aging community asset, like say an old public library, that needs to be redeveloped. And so these are prime opportunities to undertake a redevelopment and incorporate some of the units into the project. We just worked on a project recently with a public library that had some affordable housing on top for single moms and their kids. And the public library was owned and operated by the municipality, and they partnered with the nonprofit society who operated the affordable housing above. So there's some great partnerships across sectors that are available with this type of policy option. So in terms of a policy, municipalities can formulate a policy that encourages the co-location of housing with social infrastructure or community infrastructure or municipally owned community infrastructure, and then hopefully find a project that they can partner with another organization on. This can have a very high level of impact, especially if you're going to be redeveloping a project anyways, and you can incorporate some units. It's one of those low-hanging fruits that you can add some units at a time. In terms of ease of implementation, it's a bit more challenging and complex because you often have a number of partners associated with this, and it can get a little bit more messy, including the ownership structure, lease arrangements, who's going to fund the capital, who's going to be running the operation. So the structure of how this operates does get a bit more complicated, but it still can work out well at the end of the day. Municipalities can utilize financial tools to make affordable housing projects more viable to project partners. And this can include incentives such as waiving development cost charges or building permit fees. These costs can really add up in large projects and can make significant savings to an overall affordable housing project budget. And often project partners such as BC Housing, they are really looking to municipalities to provide financial incentives to help make projects work. And in fact, they are increasingly expecting municipalities to make this contribution. What I found is that project partners will be more likely to entertain an affordable housing project if there is municipal contributions, because from the funder's perspective, they have a pot of money and they're able to stretch it further across more projects if there's more municipal contributions that are made. So one way to ensure that if you have a proposed affordable housing project, to get that to the top of the file or the pile with someone like BC Housing, and to receive more interest and consideration is to make that commitment of those financial contributions, because there's other municipalities that are also competing for that pot of money, and they're going to be also providing those incentives as well. So it is about competing for the dollars that are there. The level of impact is somewhat high, and ease of implementation is somewhat achievable. It really depends on the financial capacity of a municipality to offer these financial incentives. So for example, with waiving development cost charges, you don't just wave magic wand and the DCCs disappear. They still need to be paid at the end of the day. So if a municipality commits to waiving a development cost charge, the municipality is usually the one footing the bill. So the municipality needs to make sure they have that financial wiggle room and the capacity in order to provide these incentives. And for some small communities, they might not have that revenue that they generate that other big cities have in order to make this work. So it does vary by municipality if you have that financial capacity. Further to financial tools, the option of having a municipal housing reserve fund. So housing reserve fund is where a municipality receives a cash contribution from residential development projects in lieu of actually building the units as part of a project. And typically we see this coming through multi-unit projects, but you can have a cash in lieu for townhouses and single detached dwellings as well. So what happens at the end of the day when you have this fund set aside, it can accumulate over time, and municipality can use these funds for a variety of means. You can set your own criteria on what it is that you want to use it for, but you can use it to have a one-time cash injection for an affordable housing project. You can offer grants to nonprofit housing societies. You can use it to fund research and feasibility studies and so on. So in order for an affordable housing reserve fund to work, there needs to be a sufficient a number of development projects in the community that you can leverage and make some money off of to set aside. So in some small communities where the markets are a bit slower, those funds can take a while to accumulate over time. But in communities where there's a moderate level of activity, this can actually work quite well. In terms of scale, this can have a high level of impact for projects that you can use it towards. And somewhat of a high level of challenging and achievable. It really depends on the market activities and your ability to leverage development that is going on in your community. So the next option is a community land trust. Now I didn't have this on my original package over to council earlier, but after speaking with staff, I heard this was an area of interest, so I thought I would add it in. So community land trust is an innovative option. It's a community-based model to secure land for community and social uses, and often those community and social uses are affordable housing. So that's why most of the case studies of land trusts out there is affordable housing land trust. The community land trust is typically a non-profit organization. They're created with the mandate to acquire and bank land over time, and they lease that land over the long term. That banked land is held in trust by the community for the purpose of building and creating access to affordable housing. And the land is not available for any other development types of projects. So it's only available for whatever the mandate is, and in which case would be affordable housing. So in addition to building projects, a community land trust can also acquire existing buildings that are already in the community and have that as part of their portfolio to leverage. In regarding a municipal role when it comes to community land trusts, it's generally the municipality is generally one that encourages and supports a community land trust, maybe provides donated land, maybe provides some grants, but typically the municipality is not the one that actually delivers and administers it, although there are examples where they do. Some municipalities may create a housing authority to administer a community land trust. So if they do it that way the municipality has more authority over the mandate and what projects are prioritized. But it is generally easier if it's administered by a separate nonprofit organization. It comes down to capacity and being able to really support this kind of function. So the level of impact can be relatively high, as indicated by some case studies from many communities. One that I was looking at recently for a different feasibility study is a CLT affordable housing land trust on Orcas Island in Washington State. So they introduced a land trust in the 1970s and the 80s. Small island of about 5,000 people. They were having a population growth and they had limited land area to develop, and prices were going up. So they introduced a land trust, and mainly to gear towards the workforce housing. So through their land trust, they introduced clustered single detached homes, similar to the pocket neighborhoods concept that I shared earlier. They also acquired and renovated a number of older single detached homes to be part of their portfolio, and then they brought in modular factory-built homes that were built off-site, and they brought them over to the island. And so the Orcas Island Land Trust set a criteria for how they would select those households. They'd have those households sign a 99-year lease agreement, and they had a restricted resale on homes for affordable home ownership. And it's similar to a shared equity home ownership model. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. So since the 1980s, Orcas Island has generated 103 affordable home ownership units and 29 affordable rental apartments. So this example from Orcas Island indicates that a community land trust is a promising tool for an island community. However, I have ranked the ease of implementation as very challenging and very complex. And that's because it requires a lot of upfront effort and partnerships and coordination. It requires a lot of upfront capital. We typically see grants provided and donated land. And it does require formalized administration. So the Orcas Island, for example, they used a combination of financing, loans, and grants to secure land and to cover the costs of pre-construction of their housing projects. And a community land trust is often out of the hands of a municipality and relies on other sectors like the nonprofit sector to deliver. In Orcas Island, it was a grassroots initiative, and it was a nonprofit that administered that program. The community land trust is not an overnight solution. It's a tool that is really playing the long game. It's thinking about addressing affordability 10 and 20 years from now. And it usually starts off with 1 or 2 projects and can take some years to accumulate. So with this type of a program, thinking of the long term, it works well when it's combined with some other short-term, low-hanging fruit solutions. So community land trust is a long-term, big-picture tool to address affordable housing. It's complex and challenging, but could have significant long-term benefits. So the municipal tools that I presented here have different general levels of impact in smaller communities compared to bigger cities. Financial tools, for example, have equally high impact in both small communities and larger cities, but something like an affordable housing reserve fund has about a medium level impact in a small community and a higher impact in a larger community. It is about scale and ability to leverage development at the end of the day. So most of the tools on this slide I didn't talk over. Some of it has to do with rental, and I know there isn't a huge rental stock ongoing at this time. But a couple in particular that are talked about a lot that I wanted to mention is inclusionary zoning, density bonus, and streamlining and fast-tracking applications. So I rank these as relatively low impact in smaller communities and compared to high impact in larger communities, because typically in smaller communities there's not enough development to really leverage to make these tools feasibly work. And this is based on a very broad assumption across the province. There are some anomalies in resort municipalities, for example, that are small communities where these tools can work well, but generally speaking across the province, these ones don't work so well. For example, the fast tracking and streamlining applications. If you're in a small community and you have 2 or 5 applications, jumping in front of the queue might not save a lot of time or project budget at the end of the day. But it's worthwhile to prioritize them, but it doesn't make a huge impact. Compared to, say, in a larger community where there's dozens and dozens of applications, jumping in the front of the queue, you may save 1 or 2 years in your timeline, and you can maybe avoid a higher interest rate, and that can really significantly impact the budget. So in a small community, if you don't have much of a line to begin with, jumping in front of the queue may not make a big impact. Doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile doing, but in terms of what works well to be those key intervention pieces, these ones are not typically ones that you would see to make a huge difference. So a couple of closing comments. Housing tools must be appropriate to community scale and respond to the demonstrated need appropriate to the local housing context. So not every tool in larger cities is appropriate to small communities, and not every tool that works well in small communities is appropriate for the local context. So in Bowen Island, there may be some other tools that may not actually be appropriate for your community. And remember that no single tool is successful in isolation. When implemented together, it's a combination of policies, regulations, programs, incentives, and partnerships that create a comprehensive response to affordable housing issues in small rural communities. Some of the tools I shared, like the land trust, those are really the long-term, big picture tools. So you really need to couple that with some of the short-term actions that deal with some of the issues you're facing today. And finally, it's with the tools within the purview of municipalities that can create an environment in which affordable housing projects are possible. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
You didn't address housing corporations, or if you did, I missed it.
I didn't have housing corporations on there, but I'm happy to discuss if you have questions.
So what's the difference between housing corporation and the land trust in your mind?
Yeah, so a housing corporation is essentially equivalent to having a housing provider deliver units, manage units, administer units, select your tenants to live into those units. And a housing corporation, or also a housing authority, is quasi-government. So the municipality has some control over its mandate, the projects it does, who it houses, that type of thing. So it functions just like similar to a nonprofit organization. The community land trust can be a tool or program that a housing corporation can use in order to achieve its mandate. The land trust is really trying to see what land is available in your community and take it and remove it from the market, almost like a conservation area. The conservation area is there, it's only used for conservation or ecological purposes. So a land trust is a similar thing, but it's used for affordable housing. That land is only going to be used for affordable housing, no matter who turns over or what society or what building is there in perpetuity, that's going to be used for affordable housing. So a housing corporation can have a land trust model as part of its overall toolbox to deliver it.
So we have been talking for a number of years about a housing corporation, partly because one of the residents of our island used to be very involved in the Whistler Housing Corporation.
Okay, yeah.
But as the way to go. So you talked about costs of running it and the implementation, so with the land trust, so that same sort of thing would apply with a housing corporation.
It is similar. So if it were to be a municipally owned housing authority or housing corporation, it would need staff. Some of them can have some volunteers as well, but staff, so their salaries as part of that. It has its own resources and structures. I mean, you can build off of what your already existing infrastructure is, but it does, there is an operational budget attached to that. So whether the municipality wants to take that on as part of their municipal budget to fund, ideally it's the upfront costs that cost the most.
Yeah.
Over time, when there's a housing corporation or housing authority, they build up a number of projects in their portfolio, and they're able to even generate revenue from it. If they have a combination of market housing, condos, affordable home ownership, non-market, they're looking to be financially sustainable in themselves. And Whistler's a really great example of being something financially sustainable. But the startup cost is usually quite high, and it's over time that you build that portfolio that you can be a bit more nimble and be able to leverage that, and including if you're holding on to properties and you have some equity gains over time, you can sell off some properties and take that money and reinvest it to have more units. So it's really more of that's another long-term solution. At first, it can be a bit challenging to run it through. But over time, it can be really successful. And it's mostly successful in markets that move quickly. So Whistler, for example, they had a huge demand for housing units, and they were able to build their portfolio fast and also generate revenue in a long time. Calgary has a very good one as well. They have a really good housing authority. Wood Buffalo Municipality has a very good housing authority in Fort McMurray, Alberta as well. And those are markets where things are moving quickly, and they're able to get some equity gains and earn money. So if you look at a smaller community context, things happen probably a little bit more slowly. I don't know entirely the movements in the market that's happening here, but in terms of long-term solution, it might take a bit longer to get to that point.
So I guess my leanings have been towards the housing corporation because the municipality owns the shares.
Yeah.
And we have, if we were getting land from a developer who's developing a couple of 100 acres and gives us 2 or 3 acres for affordable housing, then that's an amenity that's been given to the community. So having the housing corporation own it rather than an independent, private, like a land trust or a not-for-profit.
You have more control over it. You have more control over, you can, the municipality can set the vision, you can set the priorities in terms of what projects you want to build, what target populations you want to house for. So that is a huge benefit for a municipality to have ownership over a housing authority, is over that control. Alternatively, if that's a route that's a bit more challenging to go down, is having some clear municipal policy in the community that sets the context and the framework in which nonprofit organizations need to work under. So you can have under your purview is setting that policy. So when nonprofits, for example, maybe they get that land, they have an application for a project, and you say, you know what, our policy is clearly to meet the needs of, maybe seniors or families or whatever it is, and we want to see these types of units. As a municipality, you have that right to provide that feedback in that direction, as so long as it's in policy.
Yeah, but that's different, where they're coming forward with a piece of land they own and they've paid for and acquired, and not something that somebody's given to the municipality as an amenity for density.
That's right.
Can you talk about density bonusing and inclusionary zoning, just so everybody understands what it is?
Sure, yeah. So density bonus inclusionary zoning is looking at, it's an overall policy where an applicant, say they're building a project and they meet all the criteria for, say, zoning and height and the number of units and FSR and that type of thing. But if they wanted to have more density, they can negotiate with the municipality of, if I can get more height and I get more units on my site, I will give you in exchange, for example, some affordable housing units. So inclusionary zoning, municipality can have a policy that says, if you want to have extra density, we want this type of housing in return, and we want it for this population. We want a housing agreement registered on title. We want all these sorts of things. So it's a negotiation tool, and it is available under the Local Government Act and the Community Charter for municipalities to utilize that right.
So we've got a housing policy that says on rezonings we want 5% of the gross floor, 15% of the gross floor area for affordable housing. So that sort of fits in the inclusionary zoning definition.
100%, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just a quick question. One of the, I noticed when you talked about targets are often families and couples. What about, I'm just wondering about your take in smaller, more rural places, people that are workers in local businesses. It's the challenge that people have articulated for here on Bowen, is it's hard to find people that can afford to live here to work in our businesses. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so some communities will call them the workforce housing. They're the moderate income earners. So they're usually not low income enough to be eligible for affordable housing, but they don't have high enough incomes to afford the average rent or the average home. So they're kind of the group that's stuck in the middle. And that is it's a growing problem, especially in tourist-based economies and smaller communities, ones with more transient populations. So there's a couple of different approaches that we've looked at. I don't know if these are the right ones for Bowen Island, but one is introducing, like inclusionary zoning, is low end of market rental housing. So in the housing continuum, there is a large focus on the non-market housing, and that means highly subsidized rental housing for those who are low income. Low end of market is just a little bit below the average rents, and typically what we do is 10% below the CMHC average rent. So 10% below that, that is what we typically say that would be more affordable to the moderate income, the workforce housing. So it's just a little bit more affordable. To go a little bit further than that, some communities are going as far as looking at affordable home ownership programs. I've been doing some feasibility studies in the interior BC, looking at communities of less than 10,000 people on a model called the shared equity home ownership model. And that can get quite complicated, and it can be delivered through a housing authority or a nonprofit organization. But it's essentially trying to address those moderate income workers that are renting, but they can't afford enough for a down payment, right? So they have that barrier of entering into home ownership. So it's trying to get those households who could probably afford the monthly mortgage rents, but they just can't quite make that jump in. And a shared equity home ownership model helps by, and there's a few different variations. It's not having a down payment requirement, and there's some hoops to go through with CRA and a few other things with that, but generally they get rid of the down payment requirement. And they also share the equity over time with a nonprofit. So say you buy a house with this household and this nonprofit, over 10 or 20 years of holding that property, you sell that home, and upon resale, maybe a 50-50 split, 50% of the equity goes to that household and 50% goes back to the nonprofit that they can reinvest in the portfolio. So that's another model that some communities are looking at. In some small communities, I do caution about equity gains. If over 10 or 20 years the equity gains are nominal or not very high, then it's not really a worthwhile program to really implement. But if you're in a community, I think of places like Fernie, for example, they're smaller and things are moving fast, you can get some pretty good equity gains to share. And so that's another way to address that group if you don't have a lot of rental houses. So.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions and also a few comments. I took comfort in recognizing a number of the initiatives that we already have undertaken here, the secondary suites and the recent detached secondary suites. And we've got a housing reserve fund that Raj is going to be working on pretty soon, as soon as the budget is done. So that was great to see, and it sounds as though the secondary suites are sort of the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in this scenario.
Yeah, it is. It's the first thing that you can do to help make a major impact. It's a low-hanging fruit for sure.
And then when you talked about pocket neighborhoods, I just plain liked the concept of a pocket neighborhood. It sounds very welcoming. So a policy for a pocket neighborhood, you said essentially it's through zoning, creating a CD zone.
That's right. So at a policy level, say in an OCP, or you can have a separate standalone, it can be very broad, like encouraging compact forms of low density housing, something very broad and generic. But in terms of implementation, it goes through zoning to have the specific setbacks and the distance between each one of the homes and common green space and parking over to the rear. So there's some really good zoning examples out there. Summerland has a specific pocket neighborhood zone, and they won an award for it, I think, a few years ago. There's also, if you Google pocket neighborhoods, there's a lot of really good concepts from the United States. Actually, Roberts Creek as well is a very large scale version of a pocket neighborhood. But it can...
What is it called?
Roberts Creek. I'm sorry.
The neighborhood? Roberts Creek?
It's right on the highway.
It
right?
is, and that's
on the left side,
Seashore.
between Roberts Creek.
I'm going there next week. I'd like to go see it.
So that one is a very large scale version. It was a master subdivision plan. So it's a very large version of what a pocket neighborhood is. But you can do pocket neighborhoods as as few as 6 or 8 units, or maybe 12 units clustering together, having common green spaces, having small detached homes of 800, 1,500 square feet each. It's, in terms of efficiency of land, it is very good. But it's a bit tricky. So usually the typical zones that you have in a zoning bylaw, it's not going to fit the bill. So you can either create your own zone, or if you have a site in mind, you can always create a comprehensive development zone just for that particular site to make it work.
So we've had questions from the community about the potential for a tiny house community. So would that be a
It wouldn't. No, it wouldn't fit within that. So tiny homes, from what how I interpret them, are usually ones that are
On wheels?
between 300 to 500 square feet sometimes, maybe even 600 square feet. Tiny homes is getting a lot of traction because I think in popular culture it really had, there's TV shows and there's other things on that. And I can see it working well for communities or households that aren't going to be staying put for very long. So maybe they are going to live in a home for a year, maybe 2 years. I don't see tiny homes as a long-term solution, and this is my own opinion. Some people may not agree with me. But in terms of livability, and you think that households, their circumstances change over time. Maybe they have kids, or maybe they're a single person that ages over time. I do have some concerns over tiny homes in terms of livability. So, but if you do have a population here that is a bit more transient, maybe living 1 to 2 years, that might work well. But for other households, as a solution for something more affordable, I don't think it's a long-term solution.
So what's your definition of tiny home? Is it on wheels or not?
It can be on wheels, sure. Yeah.
But that's the issue, I guess.
Yeah.
Small people are, when we talk about tiny homes, what are we talking about? Because most of the TV shows, they're the ones that are on wheels.
That's
If you're
right.
talking about a small house on a footprint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could think of what we've traditionally had as manufactured modular homes or mobile homes. And I guess the mobile homes of the past were maybe not always the most attractive or desirable, but they sure have come a long way in terms of their standards and their aesthetics and that type of thing. And so I find those housing units, the manufactured mobile homes, as being more livable compared to tiny homes. But it depends on who it is that you're trying to serve and address.
By the way, thank you very much. Recognizing our seasonality and recognizing that we have a tourism market, which of course means that we've got people competing for the same spaces at the same time, where employers, just to be able to run their businesses, may be put in a position that they really have to create their own employee accommodation or do we have in our toolbox templates where municipalities have actually assisted, helped, encouraged and provided assistance to allow individual employers to do just what I'm talking about?
We do have examples, but they're typically resort municipalities. For example, Whistler. So they have special designation as a resort municipality that they can use tools to address things like workforce housing. So Whistler has a workforce housing bylaw. They can use things like development cost charges, revenue, and funnel that over to support employees' housing. But if you don't have a resort municipality designation, you don't have that same powers in order to address that. It is a challenging and it is a tricky one. There is some out there progressive tools that haven't been tested in BC that I've looked at. One's called a worker linkage fee. It's where you can. It's similar to a worker impact assessment or employee impact assessment. So similar to doing say a residential development, and you're looking about the impact of that development project. You want to have some information of what that's going to mean. So say an employer is going to open up a new business, right? So, and then you need to have some new workers. A municipality can go to that business and say, okay, what is the impact on our housing stock with housing, 3 or 5 or 8 more workers? And if there is an issue there, this linkage fee can utilize that to have that employer pay money into, say, a housing reserve fund to fund a workforce housing type of project. But it hasn't been tested. I did some research a couple years ago for the city of North Vancouver on this very model, and I have some case studies on it that's available online, and I'm happy to share with staff to circulate over to you. The key challenge is that it's unprecedented, and it's a new challenge.
How would you implement it? At business licensing or at the time of rezoning?
It would be at the time of application. Yeah.
To actually open the door, to get a business license?
That's right, but there is no case studies of BC, and so it's a model that really can be adapted to a municipality on what it is that you want to do. But in other respects, workforce housing, I mean, there's examples from many parts of the province where, temporary workers come in and you have, work camps, or be it, whatever it is to house people temporarily. But if you're looking at more at housing the permanent workforce, most municipalities are addressing that through their more broader policy of encouraging rental units and encouraging multi-unit housing development projects. It's usually the way they go about it, and they don't put the onus on the businesses themselves.
I mean, I've worked in Whistler for 2 years, and I lived here.
Yep.
There's some similarity, but we may not have a designation, but to a very pertinent degree, it is our reality. It's something that I would like to add to the toolbox, and it is a touch experimental or leading edge. Well, sorry for that, but I think it's one of our realities we face.
Yeah, and you're definitely not alone. There's across the province, there's a number of municipalities facing that exact same issue.
Sorry, go to Gary.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Janet. Really good chat. A couple of things that come up. We're talking mostly about planning here, strategies going forward. Is there any way to discuss any ways to incentivize people opening up their houses? Like if we've got a real rental crunch and there's empty houses out there, what kind of incentives do you look at? And I know it's based on the health and the financial capability of the municipality and that sort of thing, but what would you look at in terms of incentives, tax incentives or something like that? There's got to be something out there.
There are tax incentives. They're mainly geared toward rental accommodation, rental property, so I'm not sure how applicable it is here. So a couple of them is standards of maintenance bylaws. So if there's a rental property that's starting to get run down, then there's a municipality can have some standards of maintenance bylaw that ensures minimum adequate safety and maintenance, so making sure that the plumbing works, that the lights get turned on, that there's no mold in the building. So that only applies to rental accommodation, including secondary suites.
It's in place.
It's in place, yeah. So, but a municipality needs to have that standards of maintenance bylaw as part of your tools. But if you're worried about secondary suites within detached homes, that bylaw can help ensure the minimum standards of that property. There's also revitalization tax exemption bylaws and our RTE bylaw. And again, that can be geared towards rental accommodation. For example, say you have a main street and you have some older properties there, you can provide a tax exemption to revitalize with rental accommodation there. So that helps improve streets that may have run-down rental accommodation. But in terms of the ownership, there's not a lot that you can do. I mean, if you have an unsightly premises bylaw, for example, that can certainly help. Zoning, you can have, or OCPs, you can have some language about unsightly premises, but you're more limited there than you are with rental.
I was thinking more of how to encourage people opening up their houses and that sort of thing for rental accommodation.
People that already have a big house and they're just living in it by themselves to create that secondary.
Yeah, just as far as tax incentives and that sort of thing. I mean, do you ever see those kind of models out there?
Yeah.
Like I know I did see something on these. If you're building a house, there was incentives to put a suite into the house. And I mean, you could say, well, you're going to do it, and I think people, if they were going to pay to have a suite ready, they would probably take it all away. I would think, to get some revenue return on it, because it's the cost of house ownership is.
You can certainly provide some incentives, especially if you're anticipating a lot of new build projects, providing some design guidelines, some sample layouts, some typical floor plans, that type of thing. That can help encourage, because sometimes for homeowners it's a bit of a hurdle, or to even know how to go about it or how to do it. You know, if you have some of those templates that you know that meet code, that you know that meet municipal expectations, that can help get them a bit further. One other policy out there is a multi-unit conversion policy. I'm not sure how relevant it would be here, but what we see is some very large homes. Typically, we find them the older heritage homes, but it can be modern as well. But if they're very large, you can have a policy in place to convert it into multiple units. So from the outside, from the street, it looks like a single detached house, but it can be converted, and you can have maybe 3 or 4 units in that large house. I find that works well with retaining old heritage houses, but can be an option as well if you're looking to have infill but encourage retention of community character, and utilize the infrastructure you already have instead of building out, if you know, as well.
The other thing on management, I mean, there's a lot of talk about housing, affordable housing, just housing in general, housing for the service industry, everything else. Do you recommend some kind of a management structure like a housing corp or you know, like Whistler has it? And at what point, what kind of population are you looking at to do that? It's quite overwhelming, the whole housing thing. And we're just striking an advisory committee now. But I don't know if they'll be able to sort of mandate the whole thing going forward.
It's always worth exploring, but cautiously exploring. So whenever you're going to look at doing something as significant as a housing authority, it's always important to look at the business case. First, what is the rationale? Then putting together the business case. How is it going to be run? What is the timeline? What is the cost of getting it up and running? What's the operating cost going to be over the long term? And if you know, it can very well make it work, but you need to have that information first before you know if it's going to be a good program or not. In smaller communities, it can certainly work.
Okay, thank you.
So the issue of affordable housing for employees and maybe needing the extra in the summer, we can manage with 3 during the winter, but you need 10 in the summertime. We don't allow residential use of trailers and things, but if people had trailers on their private, you know, they've got large acreage and, you know, I'm thinking of a couple of specifics, could they, you know, is that been used in other communities as a temporary housing for employees because they're pretty standalone and self-sufficient, and if they've got holding tanks, I mean, is it just as practical as we need a place where they can take the trailer to empty the holding tanks?
It certainly is out there, both legal and illegal versions of it. So what comes to mind is when we worked in Oliver and Osoyoos, so there's a lot of agricultural lands, and they had a lot of seasonal workers that would come there during picking season. So some of those farmhouses, they had farmhouses and worker houses there, and some of them were legal and some were not. But they're certainly on larger lands, and there is some triggers for subdivision and ensuring you know, access to water and well and that type of thing. It can certainly work. What I've also been seeing recently as well is some of those turn into bed and breakfast, or they turn into an Airbnb type of as well. Sometimes that might meet the need, or other times you create that housing unit, but then it's not addressing the target population that you had in mind, and so sometimes it's a bit of a trial and error. So maybe you do support or encourage those units on those larger parcels of land, but evaluating it, who is end up living there, is this working for us, and then maybe having to adapt and change it over time. Yeah. But in terms of if it's smaller properties, you're looking at, you know, adding a trailer or something else on it. It's essentially effectively the same thing as a secondary suite or a detached laneway or detached coach house. So it'd really be up to you what it is that you want to see in the community, the standards and quality of the built form in your neighborhoods. The trailer version might be more affordable, but you want to think about livability, you want to think about you know, electricity and plumbing and all those types of things.
And those are the issues that have come up when people have said to us, I want to build a tiny house on wheels, that our bylaws consider those to be trailers, and therefore they're not allowed.
Right.
Yeah. But it's the same issues that you're raising.
It's essentially a detached secondary suite, but if it's not meeting your regulations, then then it's really up to staff and
Well,
municipalities.
because we don't have septic sewer systems,
Right.
they can't just pump into, it's where does the water come from and how do they deal with the waste is the big issue, so.
Right.
Do you have any examples of ones where they've done that?
No, usually they shut those ones down.
Yeah.
I just want to go up to the audience for a moment, and let the rest of you think some more things. Allison wanted to ask a question. What's that?
Yes, I have a question. You spoke about secondary suites, as an accessible way of getting quick housing. One of the things I think we're finding ongoing is that people will create a suite, but then it goes to Airbnb because they find that it's more financially beneficial for them to rent it out. Are other areas, are municipalities putting anything in place to regulate that at all? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, so this is a new and emerging issue in many communities, and one that comes to mind is Nelson, the city of Nelson and the Kootenays. They've had similar issues with Airbnb absorbing a lot of their rental housing stock, and so they're looking into some regulations. But since it is so new, there's not a lot of examples of where this works. And one of the key challenges is data. So we hear a lot anecdotally that some of these secondary suites are being used for Airbnb. And you can go online and you can look for listings of Airbnbs and you can say, oh, I know that where that is and I know what basement it is. But what I've heard from my colleagues is just tracking and monitoring that data to really understand the Airbnb issues. That one's a really challenging one, and so when you have limited data, it makes it a bit harder to build a rationale for a regulation or policy. Not to say that it isn't worthwhile to do that, but it certainly is an issue and it is emerging. Nobody's hit the perfect formula in terms of how to address it.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie.
Susanna?
Thank you. I was hoping you would talk about, this building on Alison's last point, composting toilets. 'Cause I'm somebody that I like to put a coach house model, a secondary suite on my land to provide low-end rental housing, possibly to a friend, because people are moving off the island because they can't find or afford the rents. But I think that the redoing my septic field would be a prohibition on me doing it. But I think I probably could do it if I was allowed to put in a composting toilet. So I was hoping that you might talk about that as one of the tools of advancing in this territory.
That's the first time that has ever been brought up to me as a composting toilet as part of a detached secondary suite. So I don't have examples that I can share with you on that, but I'm definitely going to take it back with me and to see if I can learn a bit more, because I can see that issue coming up in many other communities. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you on that one.
Yeah. Robert? And then Mike.
I was curious as to whether you have any specific policy tools around municipalities dealing with surplus and community lands.
Yeah, surplus, like municipally owned or just?
Yes.
Yeah, municipally owned lands. Well, if you're in a position to have municipally owned lands, that's a very good position to be in. I often find in communities where one of the key policies is utilize and prioritize municipal land for affordable housing. They say, well, we don't have any, we've sold it off, or whatever it is. So to have that as a community asset is really, really advantageous, especially when it comes to looking for partners. For example, the provincial government, BC Housing, nonprofits. If you have land that is municipally owned, it's in a good location, close proximity to amenities, to transit or whatever it is, then that can really help build a case and to be competitive to get those funding dollars. So what I've been seeing is municipalities looking at their surplus lands, but also not saying all of it towards affordable housing. It's really creating a site selection criteria, saying this is the target population we want, say it's families or seniors. This is the type of location that would be appropriate for it, and then start filtering down the sites that might be worthwhile for that population, and then that way you can prioritize which sites are most appropriate. Because not all your surplus lands may be worth, for affordable housing. They might be better suited for some other community asset or infrastructure. That's a good position to be in.
So can you suggest some policy tools though around that other communities well, like Vancouver has policy around it
Yeah.
as a tool.
Yeah, there's numerous, North Vancouver, Richmond come to mind recently. I helped them create site selection criteria based on their population. So what their first exercise was a housing needs assessment. They identified all the populations in need. For example, one was women and children fleeing violence, what was appropriate sites for that, so close to the school, close to shopping and amenities, and then they were able to filter it down. So starting off with who is it that we need to house in the community, and then figuring out what kind of sites are appropriate, and then you can create a framework and start narrowing it down. But you can have a policy attached to it as well. So that way when a site comes up, council, mayor and council and staff have a clear direction on what that land should be used for, instead of having a larger debate about it.
And
So
Jen,
that
just, sorry,
goes-
yeah,
That
just
actually goes back to the critical need for updated needs assessment.
Yeah, maybe.
And Jenny, just to be clear, we do have a resolution on file. We've been working with BC Housing and have a piece of land designated for if they're going to move ahead with this.
Perfect, and that's Miss Leon?
Yes,
correct?
correct.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic.
Rodney Dyke, Union Steamship. I run the marina, I have a staff problem, can't hire staff because there's no place for them to live. We have two living in our storage rooms and bathroom, couple.
We don't want to.
Second floor of the pub, a couple more last summer lived in the parking lots. So it is an extreme problem for us. I'm an architect and I started designing some solutions. The biggest problem that I've come up with is the building codes. Building code says you gotta build a stair 3 foot wide and it's gotta be so much rise to run. And it takes up more room than it can do. Now the tiny houses I looked at, but maybe I'm just too old. I get up in the middle of the night to pee a couple times.
What do we need to know, Ronnie?
And I can't crawl on my hands and go down a ladder every time I do that. So it's the building codes that you really have to concentrate if you want to try to get tight spaces. You know, I don't have to say anything more when you try to get a bedroom this high. Conversely, the bedroom doesn't have to be 8 foot high. We're down to minimums and it's like 7'6", I can't remember now. But it could be lower, those basic things. Now the float houses are exempt from some of this because they can put in a steeper stair. They're only 30 inch, but it could have just as well been 24 inch. And steep, almost like a ladder, but at least it's a stair. Those are the things I think we should be looking at.
Yeah, float houses is an interesting idea. I've looked at this a few times when there's limited land area to accommodate more housing. But if there is opportunity to do infill on land, climate change wise and mitigation wise, it's usually kind of a better fit. With the workforce housing, is it workers that are coming in here temporarily or for a more longer term permanent positions?
In our business, summer's the biggest problem,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
And yes, if we can get good ones and give them places to live, they'll stay here. But we're getting people from the East Coast that are trying to get over here because they're the only ones, the locals know that there is no place to live.
Yeah, so one of the challenges with bringing in workers for a short period of time or maybe seasonal and having them go out, say you built a purpose-built project just for your workforce housing at some times of the year, maybe 6 months or 8 months of the year, they're going to be vacant and empty. And if you build a new project and you have a mortgage on it, you're not going to be generating revenue over those other units. So that is always the tricky balancing act is being able to financially sustainable projects a long time if you're going to have some vacancy rates. That's why having secondary suites is really good because people can draw off and online.
In our research and financial looking at it, we can keep people here almost 8 or 9 months. And it if they're good housing, they'll stay all the time. But we can fill that wintertime in because there's so much demand for construction workers, not Airbnb type of place. But I could rent that out. We do all of our rentals now in the winter to construction people.
Yeah, so that could be an interesting business case if you can look at occupying those units for entire year. But even if those people change, but if you're on the books, you're still generating that revenue. That could be.
Well, the trick is though, it's the municipality. You can't just zone it for this. It's got to be this or a little bit of that.
Deviating from BC building code, I wouldn't recommend.
Not gonna go anywhere.
Getting the building code being changed or a little more flexible, I guess, is maybe what Ronnie's saying.
Navigate.
Type of housing,
I don't know if I answered your question very well.
That's all right.
Any more questions from council? Yes.
Well, it's just going back to this issue that, Allison's gone now, but she raised. There's a lot of people who do have the equivalent of a secondary suite in their house, and they will, over the summer, rent it out for a B&B. And when I've sort of talked to them and said, well, why don't you want long-term? I get two standard answers. One is, well, I want to be able to have my family come for Christmas and have a place for all my kids to stay and come for Easter and a week in the summer and stuff like that. So if I rent it out long-term, I don't have that space. The other is with somebody who's renting it for the weekend, they're gone at the end of the weekend. If I didn't like them, then I'm not stuck with them. Whereas they're not good tenants, and whereas if you rented it out under the Residential Tenancy Act and they're in, and it's really hard to get rid of them if they're not good tenants. So I don't know, if that would help. Is there some issues there which might, Gary's saying encouraging people to rent their suites out.
Yeah.
But those are the reasons why they don't do it.
Yeah, secondary suites is the easiest policy that a municipality can go through, but it's not perfect either.
Well, we've got it, but people aren't utilizing it because of these other implications.
Yeah. But it does indicate, though, that there is a demand from those households who only need accommodation for a short period of time, and that seems to be who they're housing. I guess it's more it sounds like the more longer-term renters that may be more challenged to find longer-term accommodation.
Yeah.
And I'm not familiar with the rental stock here, but I hear it's not very much available. So that might be a policy area or an area to look into in the future. Is it worthwhile looking at a small, 30, 32 unit, rental, purpose-built rental? That might be something worthwhile.
Well, I'm going to go to Sue Allen and then Maureen and then to Daniel.
Well, this question follows up on the conversation we've just been having in terms of incentives for potential landlords of secondary suites. I understand there's a few programs out there that are education kinds of programs for potential landlords, and some that will help potential renters be rental ready. I think that might be one of them. Can you comment on any of those programs and whether it would help a municipality to promote those programs, or are they tools?
There is a rental readiness, a ready to rent program.
That's it.
Ready to rent, and there's a couple of different ones that are delivered. There's one out of Victoria, and I think BC NPHA, the BC Nonprofit Housing Association, is starting to roll one out. But it's essentially providing aspiring renters or prospective renters with understanding their rights and responsibilities as tenants under the Residential Tenancy Act, and also on how to be a good neighbor and a good tenant, and that sort of thing. So they can go through this program and this training, and they get a certificate at the end of that, and they can present that certificate to potential landlords, and that provides a bit of certainty to the landlords that they have received this training. And so still no guarantee, but it's more likelihood that they understand what their responsibilities are as a tenant. In terms of a landlord, I've seen Landlord BC does quite a bit of advocacy work around this and providing tools and resources for landlords. I think the Residential Tenancy branch does as well. What I've seen some municipalities do is facilitate a renter network or landlords network locally. So facilitating little workshops or getting people together to talk about issues or what have you with renters in this particular community. And they can find that helpful, and also municipalities can roll out some communication tools like did you know, or or putting out some information awareness that we need more suites and this is why it's important, or did you know you can access this kind of information like that. It can certainly help, but the ready to rent is really geared towards the tenants.
Okay. And do you have examples of any of communities that are doing some of these landlord networking and communication kinds of things?
Yeah, New Westminster and the City of Langley. So the City of Langley, we called it a municipal landlord network, and that was mainly geared towards housing more vulnerable populations. So the really hard to house that are getting a rent supplement through BC Housing, and they use that rent supplement towards a rental unit, and landlords were really cautious about housing those types of populations. So that landlord network was really trying to break down barriers, but also giving them information on who to contact if they had any issues or damage or whatever it is. So that's a bit more of an extreme case,
right.
But that is one. And then New Westminster, there's one delivered through a nonprofit called Aunt Leah's Place.
Mm-hmm.
And Aunt Leah houses youth and youth at risk, those who have aged out of foster care and are the age 19 to 21. So they match youth with potential landlord tenants, because what they found is youth around that age are being not as well received with their rental applications, and so it's really trying to break down the perceptions or the stereotypes of young people to match them into house. So they serve as a matchmaking service between those young youth and the landlords in the community. So it is nonprofit led on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maureen?
Two things. One is, you've mentioned New Westminster a number of times, and I recall seeing sometime over the weekend a map of the areas that have made the most progress in terms of making rental space available, and New Westminster was the poster child for having done so.
Yeah.
I was curious if you had worked directly with New Westminster on any of their rental projects?
I know it well. Our firm did their affordable housing strategy, and that was back in 2010, 2012. I wasn't part of that, but since then I've done case studies on this policy called the secured market rental policy, and that is the policy that has really done well in New Westminster. So the secured market rental policy is inclusionary zoning. So they're requiring or providing a suite of incentives to developers and builders to build rental housing projects in their community. And they tie it with the term of that rental unit. So say you build a project and you are going to say, all these units are going to be rental for 10 years, then they're going to give you a small bit of incentive. But if you're going to secure those for 30 years or the life of the building, they're going to give you a whole suite of incentives. So some of the incentives that New Westminster are giving is waiving DCCs, waiving building permits, covering the legal costs of preparing housing agreements and covenants on title. They're fast tracking applications. They're reducing parking requirements. They're doing all sorts of things. So, but they tie that with the amount of rental that's being generated and how long that's being secured for. That's why it's called a secured market rental policy. So if it's secured for a short period of time, then they just give them a little bit there. And it's been wildly successful in that community, and they've since shifted from primarily building condo strataminums and over to having a number of purpose-built rental projects in their community.
Daniel?
I just had one more
Oh,
question.
sorry, I'll let you follow up.
Sure.
It's not quite a follow-up, but I was curious about whether you had a take on the province's 30-point housing plan. Some of the recommendations on the surface sounded interesting. The rental-only zoning, for example.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued. I think right now, just big picture, this is a very good time in the province, in communities in the province to be pursuing affordable housing. We haven't had this much interest from the provincial or federal governments in decades, and there is funding coming through the pipeline. So it's very promising, and it's I think it's really an opportunity for communities to leverage. I reviewed the 30-point plan, and I think a number of it is really good. I mean, still kind of light on the details, so we'll see where the budgets come in later. But when it comes to something like a rental-only zone, it's interesting. Before the 90s, we had only rental-only zones. Anything that was apartment was all rental. It wasn't until in the 90s when the Condominium Act came in that you were able to stratify those apartment buildings. And that was mainly geared towards addressing the affordable home ownership problem in communities across the province. So they were trying to find smaller units. So before the 90s, it was all, that's why the West End in Vancouver is all rental housing. That's why that stock that was built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, why all that was largely 100% built rentals, because there was no condo strata act. So we've only had, I guess, 20, 30 years where the condo act has been in. And I think it's an interesting tool going to rental-only zoning. The only concern that I have related to that is that it could unintentionally work against or go the opposite effect, to go towards ownership-only kind of zoning. And I'm worried that with NIMBYism and pushing back into having exclusive communities or exclusive neighborhoods of just one type of housing tenure. I do believe in mixed tenure, mixed income communities. So we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
Daniel?
Do you have any suggestions from council to control abusive landlords, slum landlords, of which we have enough on Bowen? I get too much of the feedback from my staff. I have about 40 people working for me now who tell me that their landlords say, don't sign the document, we'll keep this quiet. There's a lot going on, and the working person is really caught in a position of they've got no power. Even if the Tenancy Act is there, they have no power. They don't feel, they're not aware, knowledgeable to go and take forward any measure of control. And there's some pretty awful examples on this island which we, I think, quietly turn a blind eye to.
Yeah.
And it's rather, what can you propose?
Well, I think for a municipality has really limited powers in order to influence that landlord-tenant relationship. So that falls under the residential tenancy branch to be the control, the eyes and ears of that, and for tenants to be able to report those issues. But even if what you're saying is sometimes they don't even sign a contract, so there's nothing binding, there's no agreement to them to, so that's a really tough situation to be. There is some rental advocacy groups that help renters with navigating through some of the system, but I don't think they're provincial wide. It's mainly through in Vancouver. But there's this one really good resource called the Tenant Advisory Resources Network, or Tenant Advisory, TAR. If you Google it, it has a ton of resources available to help tenants that are in sticky situations such as this. But in terms of municipality, the role is really one to advocate for better controls and to support tenants. But there's nothing that municipality can do to intervene in those issues, unfortunately.
So just before I just have a question. You talked about setting an affordable rent at the number 10% below what the CMHC number was. But the problem we found with that is that people who rent a penthouse are paying such a high figure, right, that getting, once you average out the basement suite with the penthouse, the CMHC numbers are quite high. And if you look in the paper for a place to rent in North Van, you look at what the CMHC rent is, you can find a place cheaper than that, right? That's just a normal market rental.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of, people always refer back to that number, and we do in our affordable rental policy. But the numbers that we come up with, we say, well, gee, who the hell would pay that much for rent? You know what I mean?
Right. No, I won't support it.
It's the only data that we have. So in that average market report, all the outliers from the lowest rents to the highest one is all compounded into that data. And there is no other data set other than looking at snapshots. So you can go on to resources like PadMapper or whatever else lists rental units online. But that doesn't provide an annual basis or a control methodology of it. It's just a snapshot of what's being the average rent at that time. It's the easiest data set that you can measure and go back to, and that's annually updated. So from an administrative point of view and monitoring progress after time, it's a good indicator of a trend, maybe rather than a number. But the 10% below, you're right, it's a challenging one. I mean, you can change that number if you think low end of market rental is more reflective of 25% below the average market rents. You can do that.
Right, pick your number based on.
You can pick
snapshot possibly.
yeah. What I typically see is 10% is used, but you can tailor it to local context. So if 25% below average market rents is more appropriate to what is average here, you can certainly do that.
Right, okay. I'm just going to go to Gary and then I'll go to Rob again. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Sue Ellen, you've been waiting.
Well, just following up on Daniel's points about quality of rentals, I'm wondering, you've mentioned a couple times these standards of maintenance bylaw,
Yeah.
and that it could include secondary suites. I think nobody wants to dissuade landlords or potential landlords from renting, and like a, you know, but anyway, can you tell us a little bit about what would the standards of maintenance bylaw be able to help?
Yeah. It is the very basic standards, making sure that the heat works, making sure the stove is on, making sure that there's no faulty locks, that somebody can actually lock the door, that their window can actually open up. It is a very basics on making sure that that unit is habitable. So from my perspective, it's not onerous. It is actually just the minimum expectations. But in terms of administering it, it's really complaints driven in terms of enforcement. So if a municipality has a standards of maintenance bylaw, it's really when they get phone calls from tenants saying, I have this issue, that your bylaw enforcement officer can go and follow up. But otherwise, it's not something that you proactively do. It's complaints driven. There's some good case studies. Pitt Meadows, I think maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, did an evaluation of their standards of maintenance bylaw. They wanted to know how many calls are we getting a year and how much staff time are we using on this. And so there's a good staff report. I'm sure I can find it and send it if you're interested, because they were trying to put a bit of a budget or number to how much it costs for them to implement the standards of maintenance bylaw.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Gary and then Rob.
Yeah, I just, I go back to the affordable housing, and we throw that around all the time. I find it very illusionary and misleading. And so I'm just wondering, and I mean, there are standards for that. I mean, CMHC is 30% of gross income or something like that. But people hear affordable housing, what's affordable to one person isn't affordable to another. So how do you define it? The other thing, and that's a question I was going to ask you, and the other thing is the cost of construction has gone absolutely sky high in the Lower Mainland. And we're tied into Vancouver, which is one of the most expensive cities in the world, and we've already had a couple incidents over here where projects have been canceled because they can't afford to build over here and put in affordable housing. That's a reality. So, and that's only at the 15%. So, how do we deal with that? And how do we get across the thing that affordable housing isn't going to be affordable to everybody? I mean, there's some numbers out there that say for a 1-bedroom suite on Bowen Island it should be $1,700, I think, and for a 2-bedroom suite it should be $2,200. And that's a lot of money for Bowen Islanders.
Yeah.
You're certainly not going to get anybody in the service industry paying that kind of money. So, I don't know. How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
It's a tough one. It's not, it's not Fernie or Nelson where I'm sure they're building for half the price we're building.
Well, to understand who is housing affordable to, I think that goes back to maybe in-house to crunching the numbers of what are the average incomes or median income levels here by household types of families, seniors, and seeing what they are able to afford within 30% of their gross income.
Yes.
But the reality is in most communities, people are spending more than 30, upwards of 50% of their income towards housing costs. Which means that it is unaffordable. So defining affordability loosely, I think you're absolutely correct. Is that what's affordable to someone isn't affordable to someone else. Well, looking across the housing continuum, recognizing there's the non-market, the rental, the home ownership affordability, and affordable home ownership, is that people's incomes kind of slot into that housing continuum. And also recognizing that people, as their circumstances change, they should be able to move up and down the housing continuum as their circumstances change. And if you're a community that has gaps along the housing continuum, that's when people really get stuck and they fall through the cracks, and then they spend more money on housing. So I think it goes back to finding out a bit more on
Demographics and your financial
demographics
situation.
and doing some analysis. Regarding the construction, the costs, you're absolutely right. We're seeing an escalation across all the sectors. Even just not only the cost of it, but also getting trades in. We're finding that if you're doing a development project, trying to secure trades, a year and a half in advance, because there's no guarantee that they'll be available later at the time. So tendering is getting a lot more competitive than it used to be.
Just expensive, just translates to money.
That's right, and they're literally, the sector right now is at capacity in order to build and deliver housing, whether it's affordable or even the market side, because the trades are so limited. And that's actually across the province. Places like Nelson and the Kootenays, they don't have trades locally, so they still have to bring them in, and then that adds costs as well. So, and every community is competing for the same trades and the same companies. I don't have an answer to that. I think that's a broader economic development initiative of the province is trying to get in trades. But and the flip side of that is trades are also having a hard time affording housing, right? So companies are looking to recruit and retain, recruit and retain their trades, and so it comes full circle. It's all overlaps. It's all related.
Yeah, I think just people have to understand that there's a certain level where there's no more affordable housing for a certain income level, and it's got to be subsidized. And that's a totally different thing from affordable housing and subsidized.
And what it translates to is if you do have an affordable housing project and you have those trades come in and they give you your tender prices, and the budget is more than what you thought it is, at the end of the day, that project is going to be more expensive than it would have been 2 or 3 years ago. Right. And so that nonprofit society, for example, will have a more expensive mortgage. You're going to lose affordable housing units. You need market units instead to generate revenue. So it does have a major implication on delivering affordable housing projects. There's no silver bullet for it, but it's a good awareness to have the overall sector.
Thank you.
Robin, you had a point to make?
Yeah, a couple of things that keep coming up. In terms of establishing or determining your average rental amount in the community, generally that goes back to the needs assessment and stakeholder information provided. So anecdotal evidence, look in the paper, is there a rental? No. Look on the online, going online. So, there are ways of locally determining those amounts. And also, that also highlights the gaps for any projects here. And as far as determining or defining affordable housing, that's set Canada-wide by CMHC. And social housing is affordable housing, even though it's government subsidized on the continuum. We socially, as far as social responsibility goes, we have to consider it affordable housing because of the drastic crisis in housing in the whole country. So even at a community level, you have to consider all forms of housing as part of what we need to provide as a community. And otherwise, you're forsaking one group for another. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Any more questions, discussion?
That's great.
I have one more. When I lived in Edmonton many years ago, I lived in the Edmonton Housing Co-op. And at that time, it was a co-op with like 30 buildings. And they kept buying up properties over time and running it, and it got bigger and more secured. And I tried to look it up more recently. I think they've changed the name and that kind of thing, or split it into separate groups more like. You haven't mentioned co-op housing. Do you think that that's a tool that's reasonable to look at? We do have one housing co-op and a co-housing
Co-housing, yeah.
Yeah.
thing on both.
Yeah, I really like co-ops and co-housing models. They were, we saw a lot more of them in the 70s and the 80s, and then they weren't really ones that are being delivered in, but they've recently been resurrected. I've seen a lot more projects coming up. What's happening right now is some of those older projects, those older co-housing and co-op housing, a lot of them had operating agreements with either
Yeah, we have one of those
PVC or
that's coming up.
coming up, and so those are set to expire. And so when those are coming up to expiry, it means two things. One, that their mortgage is paid off, so that in theory is a good thing. But the other thing is they no longer have any subsidies from their whoever they have the operating agreement with, usually the federal government. And at the same time, by the time that expires, their building is usually aged and they need some major capital repairs. And so, so right now the co-op co-housing sector across Canada, and it's true in BC as well, is that a lot of those co-housing co-op projects, they're trying to figure out what to do next, because they a lot of them maybe don't have adequate capital reserve funds, or they're not generating revenue to really replace their building. Some of them, if they're on underutilized sites, are looking to redevelop. And so when I hear some communities are looking to build some new co-housing co-op projects, what the resources or the efforts and motivation usually turns towards trying to save the ones that are starting to go by the wayside, because at the end of the day you don't want to lose or have a net loss of that stock. But there are some new projects happening where there isn't a lot of co-housing co-ops. Vancouver Island has a lot of new ones. Couch and Valley has one proposed right now. I think it's in Duncan. It's in concept stage right now. So there is a resurrection of interest into it, and it can be a really good option for both affordable home ownership and affordable rental housing, and it's a good model for that mixed income type of model. So I do quite like them, but right now with the expiring operating agreements, people are being a bit cautious about supporting those that are about to face that expiry and how to transition post expiry.
Because we have,
Yeah.
there is one on Bowen,
Yeah.
and it's in exactly that position, and
Yes.
it backs onto municipal land.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, and there's a really good opportunity. There's a guide right now that I wrote actually a couple years ago called Expiring Operating Agreements Planning Guide, and it provides nonprofits and co-ops a step-by-step process on how to analyze their own situation, and if they're on underutilized land or they can build more units, that can be a way to get out of a bit of their situation by redeveloping land and getting some market units on it. Of course, it needs a feasibility study and business case. I can provide a link. You can Google it, or it's on BC Housing's website or the BCNPHA website. There's a really good.
if I can't find it, I'll
If you
come
can't
to
find it, yeah, I can send it over to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else come to mind?
Thank you.
This is great.
Thank you so much,
You're
David.
very welcome.
Excellent. You kind of know this stuff inside out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to follow up with staff with a few links, because there are some questions up here, and I think there's a lot of resources online that gives more case studies and examples, some pictures attached to it as well to help, maybe inspire a bit more further in this conversation.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Well, it's a moving
Thank you very
target too,
much.
that's a good thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys. That's that.
Five more ticks.
We already-
5 more to go.
Very, very great.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.